We're so glad to have all of you here tonight, and it's really, for me, an honor and a privilege to be introducing our two guests tonight. I think we can say that the Black Lives Matter movement and the Palestine boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement are arguably two of the most significant social justice struggles we are seeing in our time. How amazing is it for us to have with us tonight two men who have done so much in the service of these two struggles. Before I start my introductions, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping. A very heartfelt thank you to Verso Books for making this space available. We do appreciate having this space, and it's great to have all of you here with us. Thanks to the Palestine Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions National Committee, Jewish Voice for Peace, Adala New York, Tarab NYC, Inlace, Queers Against Israeli Apartheid, Hater Free NYC, Muslim Jewish Anti-Fascist Front, Jews Say No, and Parcio. So we are going to start out with 10 minutes presentation by each speaker, followed up by a 15-minute dialogue between the two speakers, and then we're going to open it up to questions. We're asking people to keep their questions and/or comments to a 1-minute max. I will ask you to end. We're asking everybody to ensure that they have the utmost respect for all. While we're happy to accept criticism, we want to avoid any personal attacks, and we ask you to please not carry out any interruptions of the speakers while they're speaking. We will take the Q&A 3 questions at a time or 3 comments at a time, give the speakers an opportunity to respond, and then move on. So our first speaker today is Nyle Fort. A minister, an organizer, and a scholar, he is a PhD student in religion and African American studies at Princeton University. He's widely known for his activism in Ferguson and as an advocate for the movement for Black lives. He established New York Books and Breakfast, which provide books and a meal to youth and their family. He travels nationally and internationally, intersecting various movements for freedom and civil rights. And Nyle recently participated in the Dream Defenders delegation to Palestine in an effort to build solidarity between Black and Palestinian freedom struggles. We also have Omar Barghouti with us. He's literally the man that wrote the book on boycott, divestment, and sanctions. There are some copies of the books that somebody is selling over here if anybody is interested. He's a founding member of the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel and a co-founder of the BDS movement. And he's here in the US as the co-recipient of the Gandhi Peace Award. Omar is like a lifesaver. The more Israel attempts to push him down, the higher he rises, lifting all of us along with him. And by attacking him, the only thing that the Israeli government has succeeded in doing is further tarnishing its own image and strengthening our resolve to redouble our efforts in support of the Palestinian struggle for self-determination, to end the occupation, equal rights for all, and the right of all Palestinian refugees to return to their homes. Please help me welcome Nyle and Omar.
How's everybody doing? Can y'all hear me? Yeah. All right. First, I just want to thank JVP, and I want to thank everyone who organized this event. I am so honored, and I am so nervous. And so I just want to admit that. But we're family here, right? We can make me feel a little less nervous. I'm nervous partially because I am sitting next to someone who I admire and revere, someone who I met about a year ago in Palestine and was blown away by his not only sort of wisdom, but his commitment, which was so evident in the way that he spoke to us with such generosity. So not only is he someone who represents a sort of giant to me, but he's someone who seems to be a really good person. And I just really appreciate that. So I'm going to give a few remarks, and then I'm going to get out the way so that Omar can do his thing, and then we'll ask each other some questions. So I first would like to tell a little bit of a story, and then end with 3 points around Black and Palestinian solidarity. So why did I go to Ferguson? I had just graduated from Princeton Theological Seminary in May of 2014. We had already witnessed the police killings of several African Americans or Black people in this country. Trayvon Martin, on and on and on, we can go down the line. I graduated in May of 2014, and on August 9, 2014, you know the story. A white police officer by the name of Darren Wilson shot and killed an unarmed Black teenager by the name of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. And this had come on the heels of so many other instances of police violences. So it was not an anomaly. It was not something that came out of nowhere, but it was something that was contextualized within a larger pattern, a systemic pattern of police violence and racist violence against not only Black communities, but brown communities and poor communities throughout the country. So I had just graduated, and I considered myself a freedom fighter. And I was honestly mad as hell. I decided I would apply to PhD programs, but I couldn't hardly sit in my seat to apply. Because every time I would turn on the television or open up my Twitter or my Facebook, there was another hashtag. It's another person who looked like me or similar to me or lived in a neighborhood like me who didn't make it back home, who we know only because they were killed by a police officer. So I wanted to do something about this. I knew that getting a PhD or going into academia wouldn't save us. I was doing it to try to get some resources so I can fight the fight, but I knew that I had to do more, so I hopped on a bus from New York City to Ferguson with several other activists. And it was in Ferguson that I really learned, I kind of call it getting a crash course in organizing. I learned the difference between national organizing and local organizing. I learned the difference between a hierarchical approach to organizing and a more horizontal approach to organizing. I learned the difference between social media activism and grassroots community organizing. Some of this I hope we can sort of dig into later in the talk. And the second time I went to Ferguson, this was during Ferguson October. First time I went was in August. I intentionally missed my plane back home because I just knew that the revolution had come. And so I said, I'm not getting on that flight. I'm going to stay right here, and I'm going to organize every day, and this is it. And it was really in that moment that I learned the importance of relationships, because I realized that after I stayed and the cameras left, that's when I had the opportunity to actually build relationships with activists in the community, the local community there in Ferguson. And that was something that I learned in my organizing experience that was really important. The other thing that I learned was that there was this struggle going on in Palestine. And so I was out in the streets protesting, and several of us were experiencing tear gas and trying to figure out what to do about it, and we were getting tweets from Palestinian youth activists showing us how to respond to the tear gas. I went back to my local community and started organizing, and I never forgot about Palestine. Palestine became central to the way I thought about justice, because I realized that it's not enough to simply get justice for Black people in this country if Palestinians aren't free in theirs, right? And so Palestine became a central way for me to think about freedom, and I ended up going on a delegation with the Dream Defenders, the second delegation to Palestine. And so why did I go to Palestine? So as I told you the story, there's a lot of talk about Palestinian youth activists teaching Ferguson protesters how to respond to tear gas. And that's true, right? We were getting tweets, we were figuring out that we had to get milk, we had to put it on our eyes, it would stop the burning. But I think that story sometimes hides from view something else that's really important in terms of the connection between activists in Palestine and protesters, not only in Ferguson, but throughout the country. And what it hides is a longer, broader tradition of resistance that we share, Black people in this country and Palestinians in theirs. And so I want to talk about three things today that have to do with Black and Palestinian solidarity. Before I do that, I want to also mention that on August 1st, 2015, the Movement for Black Lives dropped their policy platform. Anybody hear about the policy platform or read it? And the policy platform received a lot of backlash, partially because it named Israel an apartheid state, and it also called Israeli oppression a form of genocide. And a lot of the backlash, as we know, came from Jewish Zionists. But that wasn't the only community that the backlash came from. There was also backlash within the Black community itself. And so I'm a minister as well, and so a part of what happened after the Movement for Black Lives dropped the policy platform was a critique from Black pastors and Black Christians. One particular group of 9 Black pastors in Missouri, for example, released a statement indicting the Movement for Black Lives for supporting Palestinians. And I think that this is important because it tells a more complicated story of what we're up against, and that even within the Movement for Black Lives and even within Black communities, we are also experiencing, right, backlash to our own liberation struggle. So let me end with this. What of Black and Palestinian solidarity? I want to talk about 3 things. The first is that I think it's important that our solidarity be rooted in our common resistance and not in our common oppression. And our common resistance and not in our common oppression. I think that for 2 reasons. One is this. Oftentimes when we think about oppression, we think about what we might call spectacular violence. The things that we get mediated to us through Facebook, through corporate media, when there are airstrikes, when a Black boy is killed by a police officer, sort of very obvious, spectacular examples of oppression that you can easily point to and say, that's wrong. And what happens is when we build solidarity around our common oppression rather than our common resistance, we end up responding to these moments of spectacular violence without recognizing that it's actually connected to a longer, more everyday, insidious pattern of oppression that people are dealing with in the US, Black people and other people, and Palestinians in their context and community. And so I think it's really important that we realize that our solidarity must be built off of common resistance. The other reason is that if our solidarity is simply built off of common oppression and not common resistance, then people who are not commonly oppressed with this other group cannot join the movement. And of course, I think BDS is a great example of not simply a campaign, but really a movement that allows for all different kinds of people with all different kinds of identity to join the movement. So that's number one. I think we need to create solidarity around our common resistance and not our common oppression. Yes, I went to Palestine because Palestinian youth taught me about tear gas, and I appreciate that. But I went more importantly because I believe that Black organizers and Palestinian activists have the capacity to invent the future. I believe in this long tradition from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, from Malcolm X, who wrote an essay on Zionist logic, from George Schleyer, right? A long tradition of Black resistance that have rooted our solidarity and not simply what we're up against, but what we can do about what we're up against. The second thing is, of course, and I don't have to preach to the choir, we have an obligation to do something about Palestine because we're directly implicated in it. What's happening in Palestine cannot happen without the backing, the assistance financially and politically of the US government, right? All the way down to our very own tax dollars. And so I think it's important for us to realize that although it's happening seemingly far away from us, it's our very own complicity in what's happening there that is also a part of what we're struggling against. I'll tell a quick story. When I was on the delegation with the Dream Defenders, we were trying to go through a checkpoint. And one of our tour guide wasn't able to get through the checkpoint because he didn't have the proper documents, a Palestinian. And there was an Israeli settler who was there being very confrontational with us. And in the middle of this confrontation, he had like big old guns on him and was sort of just being very, very confrontational. In the midst of the confrontation, he looked at us and he said, "Thank you. Thank you." And I just looked at him and said, what are you talking about? And he said, "Thank you, because none of this could have happened without you, without your support, without your complicity." And that hit me like a ton of bricks. And the question is, how do we respond to that? What is our obligation to what's happening in Palestine? Not considering just simply what's happening to them, but how we are complicit in that oppression. And lastly, I just want to emphasize that the tradition that I am rooted in and come out of, the Black radical tradition and the Black prophetic tradition, has always been around a relentless and courageous critique about injustice across the board. So that means Palestine, but that also means Standing Rock. That also means what's happening in Syria. That also means what's happening in Libya. That also means what's happened and is happening in Flint, right? And so I want us to also think about Black and Palestinian solidarity in a larger, broader solidarity that includes people who are fighting crises across the country. And so with that said, I'm just going to end that and let Omar go.
Thanks so much to all the organizers for having me with you today. Thanks to Nyle for joining this very important discussion, which I'm honored to be part of. Rather than give my BDS 101, I assume a lot of you have heard that, I will address 3 different issues related to what we do in the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement for Palestinian lives. Specifically, I'll ask 3 questions that I want to focus on. The first question, which I think Nyle has answered largely, is why should Americans care? You have enough problems on your own. You have a president that's giving you every day problems that you have to deal with. Why would you even care about Palestine, thousands of miles away? And I think Nyle touched on a very important issue, which is the issue of complicity. Complicity engenders moral responsibility to act. Martin Luther King Jr. Defined boycotts at a very basic level as withdrawing cooperation from an evil system. When you think about that, it's nothing heroic. When you boycott, as in cut your relations of complicity, you're not doing a heroic act. You're fulfilling a very profound moral obligation to do no harm. If your tax money is doing harm, as it is, our oppression has made in the USA written all over it. Israel's regime of occupation, settler colonialism, and apartheid wouldn't survive a year without the massive military, economic, financial, diplomatic, academic support it gets from the United States. But you're not exactly living in a perfect democracy where you control where your tax money is going. You're descending into a plutocracy very, very fast, as you know more than I. So you don't have much control over your tax money and how it's being spent. True. But then you have the power to offset the damage, the harm that your tax money is doing by doing something positive to cut the links of complicity. Academic links, cultural links, economic links of complicity that are within your control. Your institutions, your schools, your universities, your churches, and so on and so forth. So cutting relations of complicity is an obligation. It's not an altruistic or heroic act. So that's a very important point. But on another issue related to this question, why should Americans care? I very much agree with Nyle about the common resistance, that it's not enough to explore the common oppressions, the intersectionality of oppressions, the gender and racial and economic and social oppressions, and so on. It's very, very important to point to that. But it's even more important to try to explore the common ground for resistance. And that's very, very difficult because it's not a transactional, opportunistic relationship. You rub my back and I rub yours. We do that, but that's not enough. That's not enough. So you come to our demonstration, and we'll come to yours. Okay, that's transactional. That's very basic. That doesn't help to build resistance, common resistance. Well, the other side is doing much more than that. So we'd better act up. I mean, the far right is rising across the world, becoming more unified than ever in their discourse. In Europe, just weeks ago, a couple of months ago, they had the first major conference of the far-right movements, from Marine Le Pen to the Freedom Party to Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, all the proto-fascist, neo-fascist parties getting together in Europe, uniting on a far-right platform. And with Trump in the leadership of this country, this far-right now has an even bigger address, the United States. So they're working very much in unison, developing this far-right leadership of the world. We'd better do much more than just you come to my demo and I come to yours. We need to do a lot more to build a common resistance to this far-right, a common front, a united front that emerges across the world that truly, organically connects our struggles. So when we resist injustice in the United States, especially against young people of color, as is happening in the mass incarceration system, by police brutality and so on, we're not doing it just to be nice, to feel good about ourselves, but because we really believe that resisting this injustice is resisting all injustice. It's related to resisting injustice in Palestine. I said this before, and I'll repeat it here. When I went to school here at Columbia University, I was an engineering student. No one was perfect. But I participated in the anti-apartheid, South African anti-apartheid movement. And when my fellow engineering students would see me holding the sign, "Abolish apartheid," one of them asked me, "Do you really believe that apartheid would be abolished in your lifetime? I mean, why are you wasting your time? You're an engineer, for God's sake." So I said, well, I don't believe it will be abolished in my lifetime, but I'm doing it out of a moral obligation. But it was abolished in my lifetime. And this gives us eternal hope. So it's extremely important to really organically connect our struggles for Black justice, for Latinos, for the feminist movement, LGBTQI, the climate change movement, and so on and so forth. It's very important to connect them. The second question is, how can we refute, arguably, the still most formidable weapon wielded against the BDS movement by Israel and its lobby groups, that is the anti-Semitism charge? Whenever we think that it's going away, that it's losing its power of intimidation, we see it come back with passion, especially in this country. And they're using it more repressively than ever. They're trying to pass laws to redefine anti-Semitism and to use it to suppress Palestinian voices, to suppress voices of solidarity, and to censor free speech, basically. What do we do about that? I've argued, I won't present it here, but in the new book published by JVP on anti-Semitism, I have a chapter in that book where I developed some of my thoughts on how we combat this new anti-Semitism definition, which includes criticism of Israel, anti-Zionism, calling for a boycott of Israel. They've included all this within this new anti-Semitism definition. I argue in that essay that this very new definition is anti-Semitic. By conflating Israel with all Jews, by saying that an attack on Israel, a call for boycotting Israel, is a boycott of all Jews and is therefore anti-Semitic, you're making an anti-Semitic statement. By putting all Jewish persons in one monolithic basket, you're making an anti-Semitic statement. So Israel is deeply, deeply invested in promoting anti-Semitism by pushing this new definition of anti-Semitism. And if we study the history of Zionism, it's nothing new. Zionism was deeply invested in promoting anti-Semitism and in using anti-Semitism as far back as the 1930s to push for Jewish immigration to Palestine. Assimilation was considered by Zionists a complete sin. Assimilation was considered a betrayal of their ideology. So I'll keep it at that, but I wanted to end this point with a very important point. Since there's nothing Jewish about Israel's regime of occupation, settler colonialism, and apartheid, there's nothing inherently anti-Jewish in opposing that regime. But we also must be very vigilant against any attempts to infiltrate our movements by truly anti-Jewish individuals, anti-Jewish speech, anti-Jewish racism of any sort. We have to be vigilant about that and really be very clear that we distance ourselves from any anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish sentiments, statements, or actions. The third and last point I want to ask is, given all the Israeli war against the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, since 2014, they've launched an all-out war using their intelligence services, the Mossad, the Shabak, military intelligence. Tens of millions of dollars were invested in fighting BDS, threatening us with targeted assassination, civil assassination, travel bans, and so on and so forth. Is it all worth it? That's the question. Is it all worth it? And I thought about this question in a slightly personal way, which I rarely do, but so many people told me, can you share a personal story? So I will, for the first time ever. When my our two daughters, my wife is here with me from Palestine, Safa. And Safa is not just my partner, she's my best friend and a very important inspiration. When our two daughters, Jana and Nay, first heard about the threats by several Israeli government ministers against me, especially the daunting threat of civil assassination, our two daughters were horrified. The younger one engaged me in a WhatsApp conversation, which I'll share with you. Her name is Nay. So Nay wrote, I'm just sitting there watching it all and feeling paralyzed. So I replied, that's what they want, to see us sit idly and do nothing. So she wrote, you're the most peaceful person on earth. How could they threaten you like that with civil assassination? I think I'm having a split personality here. On the one hand, she wrote, as a Palestinian, I'm so proud of you. But as your daughter, I wish you would just consider stopping what you do. Enough. And she continued, I know it is selfish of me, and it is impossible for me to accept that you just stop your human rights work. But you're my father, first and foremost, and maybe you're my father more than Palestine is my homeland. And then she immediately added, I know this is stupid of me to say. And then I replied, you know that I shall never submit to their threats and live as a servile slave. I'd rather die than live like that. So she wrote, I know this is the first lesson I ever learned from you. So I wrote, we have to besiege their siege, not surrender to it. To which she replied, you have chosen the more difficult path that has the potential to change history. There's always a price to be paid. I realize, so what can I do to help? A year later, this year, in March, Nay was the main performer at the opening concert of the Israeli Apartheid Week in Palestine, so she's discovering her own way of resistance. Thank you.
So I'm going to take the privilege of asking Omar two questions, and then I think he's going to ask me a couple. So my first question. One of the reasons BDS has been so successful is because of its ability to forge solidarity across identity, race, religion, nationality, class, gender, sexuality, etc. And one of the major discourses in the movement for Black lives is intersectionality, which calls activists to pay particular attention to identity and the ways in which those at the margins of the margins are oppressed. But this, at least in practice, poses a challenge. So how do we, as freedom fighters, both pay particular attention to the politics of identity and build solidarity across and beyond it, beyond identity? In other words, how might a principled and strategic intersectional solidarity look like?
Not the easiest question on earth. I'll try my best to answer it, although I do not have a 100% sharp, clear answer. I think there's a tension there that is not easy to address. Identity politics, as is prevalent in the United States, including among progressive movements, presents major concerns to us outside the US. We don't know how to deal with it. Activists in this country assume this is universal. It's not. It's very much a US thing that we from afar, I lived in this country, but now having lived in Palestine since 1993, I look at it with a very different eye. And we don't completely understand it. But one thing we do understand is that there's a tension between the identity politics as understood in the US and forging multiracial, multifaceted justice movements that bring everyone together. And the point is, if I feel that I can only work within my community, and that's the most important part because I am belonging to this community, it will in a way deter me from doing work in other places where I can be very influential, not just helping other communities, but bridging the justice movements together. So in other words, I think if we put identity politics ahead of the requirements to be intersectional and to connect to other struggles, we harm ourselves, our cause, as well as other causes. And that's dangerous. The second point is that if I consider anyone from my tribe as good enough because they're from my tribe, it's really problematic because many people in my tribe stink. And I need to come out against them. And not everyone who attacks someone from my tribe is necessarily wrong or racist because some people in my tribe stink. So with this recognition, I understand the intersectionality differently, and I understand work within my community as not work that assumes everyone is fine and dandy and happy together. There's a lot of internal struggle as well.
Second question. So something I've been meditating on lately is imagination. Resistance is important, but it's not enough. What does imagining freedom look like for you? One way to think about it could be, how does BDS, and maybe I can speak a little bit to the movement for Black Lives, how does it articulate not only what we're fighting against, but what we're fighting for? How might BDS be seen as an example of radical imagination incarnate, given flesh? And in that sense, why is it so important to dream in the midst of nightmarish conditions?
I agree with you that it's not enough to know what we are resisting, what we're fighting against. It's extremely important to know what we're aspiring to achieve. Absolutely. Otherwise, we are reactive. We do not build a better future just by reacting to injustices. We might repeat the injustice if we do that. So slaves who've overcome their masters without considering what a life of freedom might look like might become their own masters of yet other slaves, and so on and so forth. Rape victims becoming rapists, and so on and so forth. Without envisioning a different future, it's very difficult. And this connects actually to a question that I wanted to ask you. So I'll make this connection now because I think it's important that that we transcend our status as victims and start envisioning what life beyond victimness looks like. But the challenge is, what if our minds are colonized? We can't even envision that freedom. So you're asking me, what is your vision of the future if my mind is colonized after decades of oppression and the colonizer feeding me, searing into my consciousness that I am not a full human being, I'm a relative human that doesn't deserve full rights, and then I internalize that and I really start believing that I am not a full human being, I cannot even start to imagine what life of justice looks like. How do you want me to do that? What is the process that is needed to help me decolonize my mind so that I can envision this freedom? And then that would shape my resistance. Because without that vision, my resistance is just reactive activism, and it's not reflective activism that can lead to an ethical situation beyond injustice. So I wanted to ask you that. How do you deal with this tension that colonized minds cannot possibly envision a future beyond oppression, yet if they cannot envision a future beyond oppression, their resistance is doomed to be extremely reactive and therefore not very successful?
Wow. So, anybody else want to take a step? Well, I think I start with I go to Fanon. And I go to Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. And so, Fanon is oftentimes cited as sort of his first chapter on violence, right? We go to Fanon to talk about the legitimacy of violent struggle against colonial regimes. But when we reduce Fanon and his magisterial work of Wretched of the Earth to just that, I think we miss out on one of the major interventions that Fanon teaches us, and that is that the process of decolonialization is not merely a process of decolonizing society, but also of decolonizing ourselves, right? Mm-hmm. And so the two go hand in hand. And so I'm oftentimes kind of thinking about what does it mean to not only transform the world, to transform society, to transform the conditions that we're up against, but what does it mean to transform ourselves, and what does that relationship look like? And I'm under the fundamental belief that the only way that we can transform ourselves is by transforming the world. And the only way that we can transform the world is by transforming ourselves. It's a dialectic that we can't get out of. Mm-hmm. And so I oftentimes am thinking about what does it mean, right, for activists and freedom fighters who are talking about freedom to be mean as hell? Mm-hmm. What does it mean for radicalism to become a sort of way of simply giving sharp critiques but not giving love? Mm. What does it mean to have all the right politics, to be able to quote all the right revolutionaries, but not to have any kind of joy, not to have any kind of thing that will make people want to come to your movement meeting? And so I think that we oftentimes, sometimes on the left, we act like personal transformation is just some sort of thing of the right? And we've let the right have a monopoly on values and principles and what it means to be a good person. And then we sometimes throw away people who don't have all the right politics. Mm. And I always say, well, dang, if the stakes are that high, then my mama can't come to this movement meeting because she don't got it all right. Mm. We claim to fight for Black lives, but it can't just be the Black lives who navigated certain elite institutions and have all the right language. So yeah, I'm kind of interested in what this means, and I also want to just make a brief point about neoliberalism. We talk a lot about neoliberalism, but neoliberalism is not merely a set of economic arrangements that came out of the University of Chicago School with Milton Friedman and made sort of Latin American models throughout South America and Latin America, but it's also a profound cultural force that puts everything and everyone up for sale, even our movements. So we compete over funding. We talk about branding. Activists who never met in real life fall out on Twitter. It becomes very difficult to tell the difference between the market and the movement. And so I think we have to really consider what does it mean to resist neoliberal politicians without resisting neoliberal values? What does it mean to resist oppression, right? Outside of us without doing the work that Baldwin teaches us to, that self-examination that's always a part of revolutionary struggle. Mm-hmm. So.
Great. Okay, so my second question to you. So my second question to you is that with Trump, the US has entered a new aggressive phase in its descent to plutocracy or worse. This will cause even more unbearable suffering to many around the world, to Palestinians, many others, and to the most marginalized communities in this country, especially communities of color. How can progressive movements, like the Movement for Black Lives, deal with the sometimes competing agendas of organizing, mobilizing, and empowering the Black community, especially the young, on the one hand, and forging strong alliances with other struggles and other movements with their diverse agendas?
I think first we have to recognize how difficult it is. And that's not just sort of to get around the question. It's to sort of, some of this can sound really good in how we talk about it, but what it looks like in real life. When I came from Ferguson to organize locally in Newark, New Jersey, which has a really strong hub of Black nationalism, and a lot of the organizers and activists, are still sort of thinking through what gender politics look like, what sexuality politics look like. But these are the folks that are there doing a lot of the work. And so what does it mean to sort of recognize the sheer challenge that if you're actually organizing with real people, right, from a variety of different places, that you're going to be having to really struggle with people and struggle with yourself and kind of grow in that relationship. I think the other thing is that we have to reject a really bad form of identity politics, as you sort of talked about. And so I always like to say that identity it ought to be an entrance, but it shouldn't be an end. What happens is when identity becomes an end in and of itself, then we get stuck. That's what Fanon was telling us to get around. We have to have a more revolutionary politic. That is something that takes identity seriously, but is able to move beyond simply the politics of identity. And so I always say that I became an activist because I'm Black. And because when I walked outside of my street in Newark, New Jersey, I was being harassed by police. When I walked on the campus of Princeton University, I was being harassed by police. I became an activist because I'm Black. But I didn't stay an activist because I'm Black. That's why I went to Palestine. So what does it mean to take identity seriously, right? Not become the folks who go, let's just forget about that identity stuff. Yeah, it just kind of messes everything up. We need to think about unity, right? And sort of bypass the very particular struggles of what it means, not only for Black people, but for Black women, but for trans Black women, right? For particularity, people at the margins of the margins. What does it mean to take that seriously? But what does it mean not to get stuck there, to try to build a solidarity through that? I think it's very, very difficult. I think a part of what we have to do is have a solidarity that's both strategic and soulful. The strategic part is, what do we agree on that we can work around and work on the other stuff that we don't agree on? So it's not say, I don't care about the stuff we don't agree on, because that stuff's important too. But how do we sort of think about areas that we share common interests and do an organizing work around that? And work on, have open debate and dialogue about the other stuff. I do think that this is partially dangerous, and this is why I say we have to struggle through the other stuff, because politics is also not reducible to ends. What I mean by that is, if politics were reducible to ends, then Michelle Alexander and Newt Gingrich would share the same politics, because they both want to end mass incarceration. But decarceration to save money and decarceration to save lives are not the same thing. So yes, I think we have to have a solidarity that's strategic, but we can't be in solidarity with anybody simply because we share the same end. So I'm trying to give a complicated account. The other thing is that I think the solidarity needs to be soulful. It needs to be a soul craft. That is, it should be rooted in relationships.
But it also means that we cannot bring all our identities on the table in every campaign we do. Otherwise, we cannot progress. If on every justice campaign we insist on bringing all our identities, that a campaign against a bank X should address the trans issue, the gender issue, the racial issue, and so on, all in one campaign, we might fail. And then we get nowhere. So I can address the intersectionality of the oppressions in multiple campaigns. But if I insist that all of them must be addressed in every single campaign, we cannot move forward. So that's the strategic aspect that we have to consider, and I fully agree with you, that we cannot put identity aside, but we cannot put identity ahead of everything strategic as well. They have to go hand in hand. And I want to end on a note, because you mentioned the joy in the movement, the soul in the movement. So I read this in my talk yesterday at Columbia, and I'll repeat it here because it addresses that. I said, the great Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish once wrote that he wished he could be liberated from Palestine, so he could write poems of love, life, and mundane topics. But as long as Palestine is not liberated, Darwish said, he had no choice but to write about Palestine. Inspired by Darwish, I personally have a deep desire to end my BDS activism. Indeed, to see the BDS movement come to an end. But for that to happen, we need to attain our freedom, justice, and equality first. When, not if, that happens, I'll be exhilarated, I wrote, to redirect my deep passion for human rights to other struggles that I'm particularly passionate about, especially the struggle by Blacks for racial and economic justice and the struggle of indigenous communities around the world for reparations. When, not if, we attain our comprehensive rights, I'll be delighted to fulfill my other passions in life, especially philosophy and choreography. But until then, I have no choice but to continue my contribution to this most noble struggle for a life that is worth living, as Darwish puts it, and that can only be a life under freedom, justice, and equality. Thank you.
How amazing is that? Two such eloquent, knowledgeable, inspiring speakers that actually stick to a timeline, because I think at some point I forgot that I'm supposed to be timing you. And we could sit here and listen to you guys dialogue for hours more. So we want to open up the floor right now to everyone. I just want to remind you to keep your comments or questions to 1 minute. At some place here, there's Hani who has a microphone. Please speak into the microphone because this is being live streamed, and that's the only way to make sure that your questions and comments are heard. And we'll take 3 at a time. So I have 1, 2.
Yeah, hi, my name is Bin Chen. Just a lot of, it seems like there's significant kind of difference in opinion on where it's all going to end up. You get people like Norman Finkelstein, who thinks it's going to be a two-state solution. And then you got the other end, who thinks one state, binational states is the way to go. I was wondering what your thoughts are, especially a prominent professor in international relations, John Mearsheimer, has said in 2011 that he thinks binational state is going to be the inevitable solution. I think
the inevitable solution?
Inevitable, sort of,
okay.
Right? And then just last month, he gave a new speech, and he pretty much saying that he's not sure what, where this thing going to end up. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on where else it's going to end up, and maybe just general time frame, 30 years, 40 years.
There's another question.
Thank you so much for your insightful and poetic talks and conversations. I had a question particularly on the kind of post-Trump moment and what does it mean to organize across multiracial, grounded, soulful, strategic movements and the kind of practical concerns that happen and debates at the local community level. For example, going to a community meeting in which some members are around broken windows and know your rights are saying, we want to work with the police, and then people of color saying, well, we don't feel comfortable around them because they've been conducting ICE raids and other things. And I wondered how that also then applies to the Palestinian context, where perhaps working with liberal anti-Zionists who may also want to work with the police or surveillance state and negotiating the terms by which on some levels you might have a united front and in others having those real tough conversations. So figuring out ways in which people are galvanizing around a host of issues, but trying to collectively work with a range of political orientations in different settings.
One more question before we finish this round. Okay.
Very simple question directed toward Omar. Your daughter, what she wrote was absolutely beautiful, that little dialogue between you and your daughter. How old was she when she wrote that? It was incredible.
So I'm going to give the speakers a couple of minutes to
Okay, to the first question, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions, or BDS movement, has never taken a position on the one state versus two states issue. And this is for principled as well as pragmatic considerations. First, the principle that regardless what solution we reach as part of exercising our right to self-determination, which is a right that the Palestinian people at large must exercise, not just those involved in the BDS movement, clearly, this solution has to accommodate our basic rights under international law, which at a minimum must include ending the occupation, ending the system of apartheid, which is now recognized by a UN agency, the ESQA report issued a few weeks ago, and the right of Palestinian refugees to return. There can never be a just peace without those three rights. So regardless what the solution is. Now, we don't need any left, right, or center intellectual living in New York to tell us what the solution should be to this conflict. Former or current gatekeepers in this country who think they should tell us, we little brown kids who don't understand and cannot elaborate on what we want, thank you very much. We're mature enough. We can exercise our right to self-determination, deciding our future. And we have movements that are not geared towards achieving a particular political solution, but are preparing the ground for self-determination, which means pressure on the State of Israel, on the institutions that enable the State of Israel to continue its regime of oppression until we can exercise self-determination. So that's, in a nutshell, our position. The pragmatic issue is that the Palestinian BDS National Committee, or BNC, which is the largest coalition in Palestinian society and the leadership of the global BDS movement, is so huge. It includes political parties, women's movements, labor unions, everyone is involved in it, cannot possibly agree on anything beyond the three-plank mandate: end the occupation, end apartheid, and the right of return. Any discussion beyond that will be up in arms. I mean, we don't agree on anything. So that's a very pragmatic reason why we cannot decide on one state, two states. We stick to the human rights issue. What would happen in 30, 40 years? Okay, Nyle is a minister. I'm not a prophet. I wouldn't dare imagine what can happen in 30, 40 years. My daughter was 19 when we had this exchange. My younger daughter, she's now 20. Before you answer the post-Trump, was that an aspirational thing, post-Trump? Did he step down? I'm joking.
So to the second question about practical concerns, I think a couple of things, and they may be in tension, because I think a lot of this is very difficult. If we had longer conversation, we can get into more of the details. One is that people grow. So 2 years ago, I would say stuff like, I'm not anti-police, I'm anti-police brutality. I don't believe that anymore. I'm both anti-police and anti-police brutality. I don't actually see the difference anymore. And so that took 2 years for me to understand, right, that what we're up against, that policing is fundamentally violent. That it's actually, it's sort of misleading to actually say police brutality sometimes, because you could just say police. So people grow. The question also becomes, how do people grow? Because people don't just simply get up one morning and say, oh, wow, I just want to be radical. People are politicized. So one is a question around political education. And so demonstrations are extremely important. Marches are extremely important. I went to my first march, and then 2 weeks later, I started reading. So a lot of people get into the political education through demonstrations and through marches. So we don't have to have a binary between the mobilizing tradition and the organizing tradition. They can actually go hand in hand. The question becomes, when people come out to marches and demonstrations, do we have a place for them to go after? And at that place, are we allowing people to tell their stories? Are we affirming who they are? are we also learning and growing together and reading the sacred text, the classic text, right, of the Black radical tradition and the other radical traditions, that we're going to be able to struggle over these questions, and are we doing that democratically? And the last thing is, how do we both have a strong critique of liberalism, which we know won't save us, but don't dispose of people? Because a part of what happens is when people aren't radical enough, we throw them away. And so that, one, I think, is not soulful. It's not moral. I think we have to, that's what oppression does. Oppression makes certain people disposable. And we have to reject the politics of disposability. We have to leave room for people to grow, but we still have to do that while having a strong critique of oppression and liberalism and the relationship between the two of them.
I think that on the subject of people are imperfect, I would like to hear you both speak more about that. JVP is a small Jewish group among a huge number of American Jewish people, many of whom are very Zionistic, either because they were brought up that way or because they belong to social groups where it would be dangerous not to appear to be that way. I mean, there's all different ways that pressure works. All right, that's Jewish people. You've mentioned that in the black community, there were, I think you said black ministers, but anyway, black people who were Zionist for whatever reason. It could be religious, it could be political, it could be that some white America had a heavy hand on them somehow. I mean, there's so many reasons. I once went to a big demonstration, and there was a guy holding up a sign in favor of gay rights. I was a proponent of Palestinian rights, and so I said, oh boy, this guy is in favor of gay rights. He's been oppressed. He will understand. I went up and gave him my little spiel about Palestinian rights, and he blasted me. He said, that's anti-Semitic. So you can be suffering from being oppressed and at the same time being oppressing other people. So I don't know if there's a question in that, but I hope there is.
Thank you. I just wanted to say thank you to both of you. I found it really inspiring. My question, and sorry, I know I can't really see you, but my question is taking kind of his question a little bit further, and actually the woman who spoke earlier is further, but it surrounds dialogue and having a dialogue not just with someone who may seem like a familiar face, but really dialogue with your oppressor, right? After Trump was elected, that was a big question that came up in my head, right? There are so many people that voted for someone that I, consider really opposite to my values. And as a Palestinian, and as a student, when I was a student, this was something that would come up a lot, right? You should have a dialogue, you should have a debate, you should engage in conversation with someone who, really you would have trouble having a normal conversation with. So that's kind of my question. How do you address that question when you're confronted with it as often as we are?
On the matter of right of return, how is that going to work, practically speaking? Yes. When the house that you left
Right of return.
Is not there anymore, even the village you left is not there anymore. And you're going to have, of course, a completely different legal system, and above all, it's going to be expensive.
Want to go first?
You can start.
Okay. That the oppressed can be oppressive. Before getting into that, you said JVP is a very small group in the big Jewish American community. I don't know about that. Look at it this way. It's 4 times as big as it was a couple of years ago, so that says a lot. It's where the movement is going. But certainly, the oppressed can be oppressive, sure. Part of that falling prey to your own extreme identity politics, where you feel that your tribe is the only thing that matters. Tribe, by the wide definition of tribe. And Palestinians, quite a lot, fall into this trap. It's all about Palestine. We are the victims, the super victims, and so on and so forth, as many Jewish groups do as well. And there's a huge danger in that. You lose sight of the fact that you are not the only oppressed group in the world, and you might not be the most important case of oppression. There are other people suffering far, far more than you are. That's one issue. The other issue is that you cannot just face this oppression by isolating yourself and putting your oppression above everyone else's, without seeing that it's part of the general situation, and without, more importantly, seeing what Nyle mentioned, that you've got to connect your resistance to other resistances. You cannot possibly succeed. In this globalized world, we cannot disconnect our struggles and our resistances because we fail. Because the oppression is very globalized and very united, much more than ever, with multinationals acting as much more important than states today. It's no longer national states, sovereign states that are the main players. It's the multinationals and the banks and the financial institutions. They control states and our destinies. So it's very important to face all oppression with one ethical standard. Do you believe that humans deserve equal rights regardless of their identities or not? If you only believe that your tribe deserves rights because you've been oppressed, but not the other guy's tribe, then you're not taking a very morally consistent stance. And we should always bring that up and challenge people who fall into that trap, including people in our own camp, or what I called tribe. About the dialogue with the oppressor. You mentioned dialogue and debate interchangeably, and you mentioned something about having a normal discussion with your oppressor. I'll try to unpack those heavy terms. I believe in ethical dialogue, which is different than unethical dialogue, in the sense that an ethical dialogue assumes, first and foremost, that both parties, the oppressor and the oppressed, engaging in dialogue, agree that they have equal rights. If my oppressor does not consider me an equal human being that deserves equal rights, I have no interest in discussing anything with them, normal or abnormal. This cannot be a normal discussion with someone thinking I'm a relative human and she or he is a full human. There's nothing to discuss beyond that. So that's not a normal relationship. That's a normalized relationship. In the Arabic sense, normalization means making something abnormal appear deceivingly normal. It's very different in English, but it's a translation from the Arabic term. To normalize is to make something deceptively appear normal, and that's why we oppose it in the BDS movement. We don't like Palestinians and Israelis dancing together and saying, not because we hate dance, believe me, I personally like dance a lot, but it's this dance, this Romeo and Juliet type of thing, gives a false impression as if there's symmetry, as if there's no oppression, as if we can coexist despite the oppression. That's deceptive. We cannot coexist under oppression. We can only coexist after oppression is done with. And to get there, we have to co-resist. That's normal between oppressor and oppressed, co-resisting. For that, we can have a dialogue. How to co-resist? What are the modalities of co-resisting? So the two conditions of an ethical dialogue in our movement's view is, first, the other side must agree that I have equal rights, that I'm an equal human that deserves equal rights. Second, the relationship itself must be one of co-resistance, not false coexistence. On this last point, the right of return, how can it be implemented practically speaking? This would take a long time to discuss. But in the movement, in the BDS movement, we are not experts on the modalities of return. There are some experts, scholars, Palestinian and otherwise. There's a lot of research in the United Nations, in the cases of Bosnia and Kosovo, about how reparations and return of refugees should be implemented. So the UN has come up with this golden standard of return. It's been done before. Suffice it to say that in the movement, we insist on the right of return. It has to be recognized. It's not negotiable. This is the basic right of 68% of our people who are refugees or internally displaced. We shall never give up that right simply because it's the most basic right for the absolute majority of Palestinians. How to implement it in the most ethical way without causing undue injustice is certainly an issue that many scholars have discussed. I've personally written about that in my other capacity, not within the BDS movement, but in the movement we insist on the right.
So just two things. One is on your question, comment thing around the brother who was holding the sign. I think one is that context matters. So I'll speak from my context. So Black people have had a relationship to Zionism before the foundations of Israel. And our relationship, I'm talking particularly around Black Christians, our relationship to Israel, but Blacks more generally, our relationship to Zionism dates back to our relationship to the Exodus story in the Old Testament, which was during chattel slavery the primary way in which we imagine freedom. So Black people imagined ourselves as the Israelites, as new Israelites seeking liberation from Egypt, which was the American Empire. And so that long history, so I always say most Black Christians are by default Zionists, simply by the way that we read the Exodus story. A part of what we would have to do, it goes back to political education, but it goes back to context, right? What does it mean to engage Black Christians and Black churches? What would it mean to recognize that history and recognize that context and say, well, hey, brother, I know I know there's like this thing with Zionism, I know there's this thing with the old, with the Exodus story, but the new Israel is the old Egypt, right? We have to do that political education, and I think the more we do that, the more people will be able to see. We're not going to get everybody on board, but that takes context, and context matters. The other thing is around dialogue. I want us to think, who is the oppressor? I don't want us to take that for common sense. So there's a discourse around privilege, and I think sometimes the discourse around privilege actually makes us seem that we always know who the oppressor is and who the oppressed is. But I want to trouble that a little bit, and a part of how I want to do that is I think that we have conflated something that I would call less bad as good. So some people have it less bad, but that doesn't mean that they have it good. Privilege discourse sometimes doesn't allow for us to see that. And so we have to recuperate something that Karl Marx called super exploitation, right? It allows for us to see how people, by and large, are exploited. What does it mean that you work at a job and you make a little bit more than somebody else, but the boss is making more money than everybody combined? That's what the Occupy movement taught us. So I want us to trouble even who we take to be the oppressor and the oppressed, and this has large implications on how we do organizing work. So this is why Fred Hampton in Chicago was organizing with the Young Patriots who called themselves rednecks. These were white people from quote-unquote redneck communities who were organizing in Chicago with people like Black Panthers because they saw something at stake in common. They realized that they weren't the oppressor, that the state itself wanted them to think of themselves as the oppressor, but they were actually a part of the larger oppressed community. And that's why you see Black communists go to Alabama, and Robin Kelly talks about this in his book, Hammer and Hoe, and organize KKK members. I know that sounds crazy to us in our culture, and I'm not saying that people should go do it. I had a couple people look at me like I was with you into the KKK thing. Let me be clear. I'm not advocating people to go do it. What I'm simply saying is that there is a tradition of people who are seemingly different on the surface, but who are able to see a different realm of solidarity when they begin to trouble the categories of oppressed and oppressor.
Over here, do you still have a question?
Thank you. Omar, Nyle, it was a pleasure hearing you guys speak. My name is Samir, and my question is about the future. Not 30, 40 years in the future, but clearly you both are visionaries. And you spoke a little bit about it with the refugees' right to return and reparations. And so my question is based on if either of you have studied apartheid South Africa and what happened after, a week, a year after. How does apartheid Palestine look a week, a year after? And I know maybe Omar said you were passionate about self-determination, but you said how does a colonizer see the future if his mind is colonized? So it's actually a question for both of you because I'd like to hear both answers. Thanks.
Thank you both so much. I have a question about anti-Zionism. In the Jewish community, there's a kind of trope that if you're anti-Zionist, you deny the right of Israel to exist. And I'm interested in your perspective on this idea of whether you can be anti-Zionist and not deny the right of Israel to exist. I'm not even sure I understand what this means, to deny the right of Israel to exist. I'm not sure if it's in theory or in practice, but I know it's a grave concern, and if you, as a Jewish person, come out as an anti-Zionist, people will call you an anti-Semite, a self-hating Jew, because you supposedly deny the right of this particular state to exist, whereas many other states do exist. So I'm interested in your perspective on that.
Thank you. My question, I was wondering if, Reverend Fort, if we could go back to what you were saying about not throwing away liberals. And I guess I was wondering from both of you, what, in your work and in other movements, what do you see as working best, like as being most attractive to liberals right now? Like who's succeeding and how are we succeeding in reaching people and pulling them from that more limited view over to where we want them to be?
I'll try to speak. So I can't speak to post-apartheid Palestine. I won't try to. What I will do is sort of just offer what it means for us to look at Black people post-emancipation. And so a part of the liberation struggle for Black people was a certain kind of access to the very institutions that barred us, right, for out of the very category of human, but also out of the sort of legal institutions whereby we could become empowered. And so in the 1960s and early 1970s, you have the rise of a Black political leadership class. You have Black mayors, you have Black superintendents, you have Black cities that are primarily ran by Black people. In Newark, New Jersey, where I live, Newark, New Jersey has been ran by Black people since the early 1970s. And so what we noticed is that the rise of the Black political leadership didn't necessarily equate to Black liberation. The fact that we had Black faces in high places doesn't necessarily mean that the masses of Black people are being empowered or being liberated. And I think we see some of that connections even in sort of the Palestinian Authority and certain ways, I mean, you mentioned South Africa earlier, certain ways that a politics of representation is not enough. I mean, Barack Obama is the sort of quintessential example. With notions of post-racial, colorblind America, because we have a Black face in the White House. Meanwhile, we have 1 million more in the jailhouse, right? And the question becomes, how do we view progress? Do we view progress through this one man who was able to make it into that position, or do we view it by a sort of larger understanding? I have to think more about what's most attractive to liberals, so I'm gonna let Omar take it over, and I'm gonna try to come back at the end.
I was hoping he would help me with this one, but anyway. On apartheid South Africa, yes, it's mandatory in the BDS movement to study apartheid South Africa. You cannot talk about BDS without studying that. And of course, apartheid South Africa is not over. Political apartheid is over, economic apartheid is live and well. Whites control the economy of South Africa until today. They own most of the resources and the goods in South Africa until today. The Black majority are still disenfranchised economically, not politically. So yes, they can put a piece of paper in a box every number of years, but that's not changing land ownership. That's not changing housing fast enough. That's not changing access to resources fast enough. We've learned a lot from that experience, that political emancipation alone, especially in this globalized world where neoliberal economics control the world, is certainly not enough. Without associating that with social justice, economic justice, it's useless. It's totally useless. So yes, you think you're free, but you still live in miserable conditions, completely controlled by the oppressor, just the oppressor dressed differently. They look nicer. and they make you feel nicer that you have access to power. But what power? What power without any economic justice or social justice? So it's extremely important to discuss that. Now, the tricky thing is, how do you do that within the BDS movement, which has a very clear mandate? It addresses occupation, apartheid, and the right of return. It doesn't get deeply into social economic justice issues. So how do we deal with this? On the one hand, from our intense relations with leaders in the South African anti-apartheid movement, we understand very well that it's not enough to end political apartheid. On the other hand, our platform does not allow much. As I said, we don't agree on much beyond the 3 points. It doesn't allow for much discussion, or let alone campaigning on social and economic justice issues. The one issue that is important in our platform that allows us to address it indirectly is the issue of refugees. Since the absolute majority of Palestinians are refugees or internally displaced persons, the issue of return and reparation becomes essential in the beginning of addressing the social economic justice issues, not just the political issue. That's why those who want to reduce the question of Palestine into ending the occupation of the 1967 territory, ignoring the right of Palestinian citizens of present-day Israel and the rights of refugees, are reducing it to something that will predominantly continue the status quo. So it's not enough. On the anti-Zionism issue and denying the right of Israel to exist, I think Israel is the only country on earth that maintains this divine right to exist regardless of what regime it has. I mean, we've never, at least I have never heard this term used in any other country, including a country like Bangladesh, where at least 1/3 of the state disappears during monsoon season with floods, and the Bangladesh people never bring up the issue of whether they will exist or not. It's taken for granted that they exist. Israel is the only country that's so obsessed about not just its existence, its right to exist, and there's no questioning, exist as what? So does a slave owner has a right to exist? Does a slave owner have a right to exist? As what? As a slave owner? No, hell no. No, they don't have a right to exist. So exist as what? Does any apartheid regime have a right to exist? No. Does any occupation have a right to exist? No. Does any settler colonial state have a right to exist? No. Do people have a right to exist? Of course. So this strange question is usually asked in the Jewish community in this country and elsewhere. It might reflect some collective trauma, certainly. It might reflect some collective paranoia, although I heard from Rebecca yesterday that she's accused that she's not paranoid enough, and that's a problem. I think it's good not to be too paranoid. So I understand this question as putting Israel above everyone else, on a pedestal, as Archbishop Desmond Tutu once said, above every other state. Only with Israel this question is asked. So long as Israel is put on a pedestal above everyone else, this is denying us our right to treat Israel like everyone else, according to the same standards of international law that should be applied to every state committing similar crimes. And it's not just bad for us that Israel is put on a pedestal, especially in this country, it's also bad for the fight against anti-Semitism. Because guess what? If you rank racisms this way, and you put anti-Semitism above every other racism, and you put Israel above everyone else, this certainly promotes anti-Semitism. It doesn't help at all in the fight against anti-Semitism. The third question about Ari's question, appealing to liberals. We're often accused in the BDS movement that we do a lot of that we're not radical enough. I have no idea how we're accused of that, but we're accused of that quite often, that we spend too much time worrying about reaching the mainstream and appealing to the mainstream. I personally do not see that as something necessarily negative, as long as you're not betraying your principles. So I think some people on the left are addicted to marginalization. They cannot deal with the fact that you might gain power and strength and become more mainstream. It doesn't mean that you're selling out necessarily. I mean, you can be principled and still gain power. look at JVP. It's becoming more principled and more powerful. It hasn't become less powerful because it's more principled. So, and I don't think the BDS movement is becoming stronger by selling its principles. So, appealing to the liberal mainstream by using accessible language that everyone can understand, by appealing to some values that people can share. So many people in this country have a kind of an inherent sense of fairness. Okay, Americans are not big on international law, it's like Chinese to them, but they understand, there's an inherent feeling about fairness. We can appeal to that sense. So people do not understand necessarily settled colonialism and apartheid and so on. Too complex for most American audiences. But, excuse me. But if you tell people, you know, someone occupies your home and throws you out, and then when you try to come back, they tell you, oh, you're too many. You have too many kids. How can I allow you back to the home? Well, damn it, this is my home. You kicked me out, and now you're worried about having too many children who want to go back? You occupied my home. People would get that, rather than giving the big spiel about right of return and 194 and United Nations, which again is Swahili to Americans. So I think appealing to a liberal mainstream is essential. It's not a luxury. It's essential in the kind of work we do if we want to go beyond the margins and reach a much, much wider audience. But we always have to be very vigilant about not selling out our principles.
And I was really frustrated with not being able to answer the question about liberals. And I think partially is because in my personal context, you know, I think a part of one of the main strategies, which is not reducible to a strategy, but is also, again, a soul craft, is that you meet people where they are and you meet people's needs. And so when you look at someone like the group like the Black Panther Party, they didn't go in talking about liberals and radicals, and they went in and said, all right, we're going to set up a free breakfast for children program where your kids can come and eat at 5 a.m. every morning because we know they're going to school hungry. We're going to have a medic program and an ambulance that comes pick up these Black people from this community, because when they call the ambulance are either afraid to go to their community or they're racist and won't go to their homes and pick them up and take them to the hospital. And we're going to create programs like the Young Lords did right here in New York City to clean up trash on the streets. So they were doing this in the context of an ideology and a movement. So they were feeding the kids the breakfast and saying, hey, you know, a part of the reason why some kids go to school hungry is because of this thing called capitalism. And then there's other way called socialism that everybody can be able to eat and go to school and learn. And so that's not for everybody's context, perhaps, but I know some of us who are in context where people are struggling. Some people can't go to a movement meeting or a demonstration because they got 3 jobs. Because they got 4 kids, they're trying to make ends meet. How do we make sure that those people have access to our movement? And I think we have a long tradition and history of people who have met people right where they are and have connected that to an ideology and a movement that's broader than just a tactic.
First of all, thank you so much. I'm really grateful to get an opportunity to learn from you both. Omar, I've been struck by, you've said a few times that there are three points or principles that the BDS movement agrees on and everything else you disagree on. I'm curious about how the movement has addressed disagreement internally and how you've dealt with it poorly and what you've learned from that, and when you've dealt with it gracefully and what you've learned from that, and also how the movement has evolved through internal disagreement, dissent, fragmentation. And then one last piece of that in terms of what we can learn from how the movement has changed is particularly when there's a movement that's criticized from the outside and needs to maintain a particular strategic unity in order to be successful. How do you navigate internal differences, dissent, with external strategic unity?
You want all this answered in 2 minutes? That's a workshop.
If I understood you correctly, I think at one point Omar raised the very important question of who stinks. And I think, I think we have to say, in my mind, who stinks is capitalism stinks. And although finally somebody actually said that word, I think the reason to think about it that way is that capitalism can't survive without racism. Most fundamentally, that capitalism invented racism, and even today, when you add up in the United States, you add up the differentials in wages and the differentials in services, comes to like at least 25% of the GDP. And most importantly, it keeps people divided and from acting together. And I think the lesson of that is, has been partially alluded to, that everybody is affected by racism in the sense that we're divided and this double standard is created, and that we have to unite with each other on the basis of class, not on the basis of identity. And I dare say Israel couldn't survive without the exploitation of Palestinians and immigrant labor and underpaid Mizrahi labor. And so, although I understand, obviously, that overthrowing capitalism is something in the distant future, we know that capitalism is going to affect us all in the sense of coming climate disaster, probably in the sense of world war. And seeing it in that context makes us see that we need an international movement that unites all of us who aren't capitalists on that class basis. And I understand that mostly you've been saying that. I always just want that actual word to be said overtly.
Hi, how are you? Thank you very much. I really loved your talks, both of them. Neil, especially when you said entrance and in. I really love that. I wanted to say two things, two examples of identity politics that are extremely good and bad. One of them, I think it's good to look at examples in history with people with certain identities who were able to do organizing, like Bayard Rustin, who was in civil rights movement, and he was a gay activist, and the way he was able to organize with people who actually thought that he was a pervert, and he was a gay man, and he was arrested for criminal activity of sex with men. But he kind of brushed it off, and he didn't take it so personally. He kind of got over himself and, rolled up his sleeves and worked with the movement. I think it's good to look at those examples. But it's also good at looking at how this whole identity politics, specifically gay rights activists, how they're using this to oppress other people outside the US. For example, just recently, I received this letter from a friend who was in a human rights organization saying that, can you read this letter that came from Afghanistan? This guy is claiming he's gay and he wants to come here as an asylum because he's gay in Afghanistan. And the story needs to be verified. I'm like, why? Why do you need to verify? How can you verify? Does he need to send you a picture of him sucking? What is it? What? You drop a bomb that is the mother of all bombs on a group of people and you kill all of them, but somehow the ones who have a dick in their mouth or some other way, they are more worthy. And this is the part that identity politics become used in this very gross way. So I think it's good to look at these two examples and figure out where we want to stand. That's all. Thanks.
I can start.
I'll go ahead with one thing.
You want to start? Right.
One thing. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the comment about capitalism. And so I think that it's very important to have a freedom movement that's grounded in class struggle, class analysis, a materialist understanding of our lives and our existence, of our relationships. I also think that we have to reject an economic reductionist argument That is, that if we simply get rid of capitalism, then we get rid of all oppression. And so, we can debate about this all day, but I do want to throw this on the table because I think it's very important. There is a particularity to anti-blackness that we have to name. There's institutionalized racism, and there's a particularity to anti-blackness. So we have to be able to explain why, after the lynching, the limbs were cut off and sent to family members as souvenirs. We have to think about that. It's what some scholars call gratuitous violence, all right? We have to think about not simply, so this goes back to the particularity and the unity. This shouldn't divide us, but we have to think about what does it mean? That's a contemporary example. What does it mean for people with black-sounding names who have a college degree to be less likely to get a job than white-sounding names with simply a high school degree? That's not, we can't reduce some of these things simply to economic arguments, and I think that we have to be careful not to do that.
I want to start with this point, and I completely agree with Nyle, actually. Anti-black racism exists in all societies, capitalist, socialist, and otherwise. I'm not aware of any society on earth that does not have anti-black racism. So we have to think beyond just the economic and class issue, I think. We cannot dismiss the identity issue and just focus on the economic issue alone. I think both of them are extremely important. So getting rid of capitalism is very important, but not because it will end all racism. It won't. Because it will end a whole set of other exploitations and oppressions, but not necessarily racism. Racism needs to be addressed at another level altogether. It's not just here at the economic relations level, it's at the mental level, intellectual level, cultural level. And that's much, much more difficult sometimes. You can see an economy changing, you can see an economic system changing, and people's ideas, faiths, religions, positive or negative, can last on and linger on for thousands of years, largely unchanged. So we have to address that at the cultural level, not just at the economic level, and there's a connection between the two, I think. On the workshop, on the BDS movement, it will need like an hour to give justice to your questions, so I'll try to give some pointers. I'm talking about the BDS National Committee, the Palestinian BDS National Committee, the BNC, not the BDS movement at large, because it's decentralized. We have partners all over the world, and clearly there's no central command, there's no pyramidic structure, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to stick to the Palestinian BDS National Committee or the BNC. How we deal with disagreements, how we deal with critiques, with criticism, very harsh criticisms sometimes. Disagreements we deal with by going back to the agreed upon guidelines and the agreed upon sacred agreement that we stick to the three rights. So if anyone brings in an issue beyond the three rights, beyond the mandate of ending the occupation, ending apartheid, and the right of return, we try as much as possible to see if it fits within this rights platform. If it doesn't, we leave it on the side. It doesn't mean that we do not address this in our other capacities. So I'm a feminist. Now, the BDS movement is not necessarily a feminist movement. So I don't need to address feminism within the BDS movement in a very blunt way. Of course, it comes across. It's generally a progressive movement, it's anti-misogynistic, and so on. But I can also join other struggles on feminist rights. I don't need to do it in a BDS campaign against G4S, which is doing mass incarceration, for example. That's a different campaign. That's what I meant when I said we don't need to bring all our oppressed identities on the table in every single campaign. We cannot succeed. We can never go ahead with a campaign and succeed with that. How we deal with criticism is a different issue. We have a very simple rule in the BNC. If criticism, no matter how harsh it is, comes from marginal circles, like far-right Zionist circles in this country who attack us of all kinds of things, we have the big capital I principle, ignore. Literally, we just completely ignore it. And not just from far-right circles, also far left circles, or dogmatic circles from individuals who are former gatekeepers who used to be, in their heyday, important and have lost that gatekeeper position due to the BDS movement, giving, God forbid, the right to Palestinians to speak for ourselves, so that we don't have intermediaries, white, nice intermediaries in this country who speak on our behalf. So those people sometimes might be very, very harsh in critiquing us. Again, we ignore. We don't engage. We have a much bigger enemy to deal with. We cannot waste our time in those internal fights that are useless, that just are a distraction. You have a big elephant in the room, a system of occupation and apartheid to fight, and all the lobbies connected to it, and the goddamn administration you have in this country. We have enough to worry about. We cannot worry about the petty things. That's, in a nutshell, how we deal with it. On the last question, which is really tough, the identity politics and the gay Afghani example, I agree with you that sometimes identity politics is used in such an, how should I put it, in such an unfair manner that is unfair to everyone, including the community that's supposedly being saved or salvaged by the nice white liberal culture, especially women. Whites love to save Afghani women or Arab women, right? I mean, without them, how can our women be liberated? And it does a disservice. I mean, at first it reduces Arab women, Afghani women, Muslim women into those who lack any agency. You know, they're subjects waiting for the savior to take them to this haven of rights. So it reduces them to lesser humans, I think. It does service to no one. It does justice to no one. But in that sense, yes, identity politics can be extremely harmful. That doesn't mean that in some cases, you do have to address the identity issue. If you're a woman in Saudi Arabia, that is an extremely important part of that identity is extremely important to your entitlement of rights. If you're a non-Jew in the State of Israel today, that's extremely important. It's not a coerced kind of identity that you're imposing on someone. This defines your entitlement to rights. So clearly you have to address that, but without abusing it, without saying, oh, because this person is a Christian Syrian, we should let him or her into the United States because, you know, they're from the good tribe. But those Muslims, oh, God forbid, we should allow them. Well, they're refugees as well. And being a refugee makes no difference between this guy wearing a cross or this guy wearing a Quran or otherwise, not having any religion. So we have to be consistent in a way. So I don't have a very clear answer to it. I can see your point exactly that it's very complex, at times how to address identity politics, and at times how to be aware that it's being abused. I'll keep it at that. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Thank you. So just to go back to the South Africa example, it seems like during the anti-apartheid movement, the critical part of the transnational advocacy network that helped to bring apartheid down was black people here in the United States. And just the black identified community, especially religious communities as well. And then in terms of now, and that was kind of a critical part that took the B and the D and connected it to the S. So my question is really like sanctions, like where are we at right now? And how can the Palestinian community here do something similar as black communities did in the past?
I'd just like to give my opinion about something. I think, wait, is this?
Yeah, is it on?
Okay. I just want to make a statement of my opinion. To me, at this point in the United States, I think the most critical thing about BDS is protecting the right to BDS, and that means very prodigious work to prevent more anti-BDS legislation. I've had a discussion with a lot of people, and they just feel that since anti-BDS legislation is illegal, we don't need to do anything about it because it can't really be upheld. I feel that, you know, even if you do an executive order like they've done in New York, the damage is already done, and people are intimidated, and those that might divest or might, you know, do whatever they want to boycott Israel are too intimidated to do so. So, you know, by default, it's effective. What is being done locally, internationally, nationally to educate our congressmen and senators to vote against anti-BDS? How can we be more prodigious on this? I don't see having one or two public demonstrations as being very effective. It needs to be a daily grind. What can we do?
Good evening. First of all, thank you very much for having this conversation. It's very enriching. So my question has to do with isolationism and insularity. You know, I'm an immigrant. I'm originally from Kenya. I grew up in New York City, and I've had the fortune of knowing a lot of people from different immigrant communities and different backgrounds my whole life, like real, actual relationships and friendships. So I am engaged in a lot of conversations with a lot of different people who have various stages of consciousness about whether it's politics or issues in America and how they relate to the world or whatever. So I speak multiple dialects, if you will, right? But what I'm curious about, because I've seen this as being a huge problem in this country, and I feel like this election really brought it out with the fact that undereducation and a certain isolationism in the United States has led to a certain vulnerability to propaganda, which I think that was very effectively utilized with so-called fake news throughout the course of the election. And we can see it being used right now. And I'm kind of just curious about this conversation, because I've never really been able to have it before. You know, in a general kind of public forum, Americans don't think of themselves as being Americentric. They just don't understand what that means. And I think in this moment, it's become very, very clear that Americans have a huge blind spot when it comes to facts and information about each other and facts and information about the world. And I'm curious about what both of your opinions are as organizers and activists around how either having a conversation about that right now might be helpful, or how this fact, which I think it is a fact of existence in this country, how this blind spot might have an effect on the work that we're all trying to accomplish.
The first question about South Africa and what blacks in this country, the role blacks in this country played in helping to bring an end to apartheid by pushing for sanctions in the United States as well as elsewhere, and can Palestinian Americans in this country play a similar role, if I understood your question. It's no coincidence that S comes last in BDS. If we understood anything from the South African anti-apartheid movement, is that there's no way to reach the level of sanctions without building the movement from the grassroots up and do a lot of boycotting and divesting and really building the movement to have an impact. I'm not a believer that your Congress can wake up and become moral. I personally, I've been disabused of this notion ages ago. I believe that elected officials, especially in this very corrupt system that you call democracy in this country, institutionalized corruption, that is, requires pressure. And if pressure doesn't work, then more pressure. It's not about persuading Congress people. They must feel that if they don't act this way, they will lose their seat. I think that's the only language they understand. I doubt most Congress people understand any other language. Whether it's international law, human rights, justice, or any other notion, it's not important to them as much as maintaining their seats. So can we build up a movement that is powerful enough, that's strong enough to present a real threat to those elected officials that if you don't act the right way on the right side of history, we shall not elect you again to your seat in Congress? When they feel that we have enough power, they will act. In the South African anti-apartheid movement, it's not like Congress woke up and became moral. As you rightly said, when churches and institutions and universities and student groups and academics and everyone moved in the right direction, and blacks led that movement in the United States, absolutely, it took ages to get to the point of sanctions. Ages, it took decades. We at Columbia University struggled for so many years to get our board of trustees to divest Columbia University funds from companies involved in South African apartheid. So it's a huge, long struggle, but there are no shortcuts. Now, Palestinian Americans do not compare in that sense to black Americans, neither in numbers, nor in political power, nor in political awareness or involvement in the political system. If blacks were disenfranchised politically, we're far more disenfranchised as a community in this country. Palestinians are just not a force to be reckoned with in the United States, not yet. So we hope that by making connections between Palestinian Americans, Arab Americans in general, and other communities, especially communities of color, progressive Jewish Americans, then we can build a base, a progressive lobby, if you will, that can push Congress and elected officials at the state level, at the city level, to make change real. When you look at the statistics, according to Brookings Institution, about 46% of all Americans support sanctions or tougher measures against Israel. Just imagine, almost half, 1 of every 2 Americans supports sanctions against Israel. This is not reflected at all at the level of elected officials because those polls don't have legs. They don't walk. We need to build the political movement that makes them, that leverages this public opinion shift to affecting political change by, again, giving those elected officials that choice. So I think there's no shortcut, and we need to do a lot of what we're doing. We just need to do much more of that to get to the S level, the sanctions level. On the right to BDS question, I absolutely agree. It's very important. I disagree with the view that just because in the US we have a solid First Amendment of the US Constitution that protects freedom of speech, it's the most robust freedom of speech constitutional protection in the world. No other country has anything comparable to the protection of free speech in this country. I mean, Europeans do not have anything similar to what you have in this country until the next right-wing Supreme Court judge is chosen, and then we don't know what will happen to that, or Roe versus Wade, or equality of blacks. We have no idea what will happen. But until then, you still have this wonderful First Amendment, and I think we should use it. We should not sit on our hands and say, let's do nothing because the Constitution will protect us. Again, the Constitution has no legs, never had legs. It takes political movement building to push to interpret the Constitution the right way. Otherwise, the other side will mobilize to interpret it the wrong way. So let's not sit on our hands. We really need to move and protect the right to BDS. But in doing that, we have to remember it's not just about Palestine. Addressing the right to BDS is addressing the essence of the right to free speech in this country. Just as during McCarthyism, those who thought that McCarthyism was targeting the lefties and the communists and the liberal Jews and whatnot learned very fast that it's targeting everyone who dissents from the establishment party line. Similarly, I think the far-right lobbies in this country, not just the Israel lobby, Israel is the facade of this, and it's certainly a dynamo in this movement, the new McCarthyism in this country. Israel is a very important component of it, but it's not the only player. There's so many interests in suppressing free speech in the interest of big corporations, big military, homeland security, the military-industrial complex, and so on. If they get away by suppressing the Palestinian right to free speech, the right to BDS, they will go after everyone else. Soon enough, Black Lives Matter will be declared illegal, and every other speech that bothers the system will be illegal. So no one should feel comfortable, oh, it's just a matter of BDS and Palestinian rights. It's all of us. It's either we all win and protect the right to free speech in this country, or we all lose. On isolationism and vulnerability, I'll leave that to you.
So yeah, on that question, I think this is a part of the reason why protests are still important. So a lot of times we have a critique of like, well, you know, all y'all do is protest, right? And there's a sort of, sometimes the critique comes from a bad place, that is from people who are sort of don't believe that we can win in the first place and don't know what all that hoopla is about. And then sometimes it comes from a genuine place of like, you know, is this gonna work? You know, is this protest stuff going to work? And I think one of the things, and John Berger talks about this, he calls protest a rehearsal for revolution. And a part of what he's talking about is the ability for protest to push back against the atomizing of ourselves in society. That is, we just do in our little cubicles, our little lives, our little jobs, do our own thing, take care of our own selves. And what protest does is it completely disrupts the atomizing of our everyday life, where we don't talk to each other. We don't know that homie next door cared about this too, or that someone at our job might be interested in going to a protest, right? And so I think that's part of the reason why protest is important. We have to push back on the sort of move away from protests as movements get older. They were born in a sort of radical protest, and they need to stay there. So someone mentioned Bayard Rustin earlier, and Bayard Rustin is a sort of champion of black liberation in this country. One of the mistakes that I think Bayard Rustin made, though there's a lot of good to say about Bayard Rustin, is when he wrote the article From Protest to Politics. That became a sort of classic essay that really was trying to shift the energy of the civil rights movement into the Democratic Party. And I mean, we hear Sharpton say this at the funeral of Michael Brown. He says, we got to turn demonstration into legislation, right? And so I think we have to not choose between protest and politics or protest and policy. We need protest and policy. We need protest and legislation. We need everything that we can do that can possibly get us free. And then again, going back to what I said earlier, the question is, how does that become a window for people to experience political education? Right? So if the protest space is a place that we sort of push back on this atomizing, on this insularity, on college campuses. I'm a graduate student. We have a grad student union that's organizing, which has been one of the only places that grad students, shout out to Edna who's a part of that work, one of the few places where us grad students who are just reduced to our work, reduced to products, who make products, all about your research, can come and begin to organize ourselves and begin to realize, like, dang, you might be a molecular biology student, I might be an African American studies student, but we have something in common. And so I think we have to keep that protest, and we have to add the protest to a political or a popular education. And the last thing is, for black people in this country, you know, I keep trying to emphasize a tradition that's not only anti-racist, but that's also anti-imperialist. So you mentioned a blind spot, and that blind spot is not just by white liberals. The blind spot is also by particular people within black communities that want essentially a piece of the pie without critiquing the pie itself, saying that there's something fundamentally wrong with the pie. And not just for us black people here in this country, but for people across the world. That's not, like you said, just Palestinians. You have slum dwellers in India. You have landless farmers in Brazil. You have people around the world who are suffering. And the question becomes, are we against injustice just for us? Are we against injustice across the board? And the best of our tradition has always said the latter.
With that, I'd like to sincerely thank Nyle and Omar for joining us tonight, for sharing. For sharing their insight, their humor, their humanity, their knowledge, for hopefully helping us all to begin to continue our work to decolonize our minds. I would like to encourage everyone to look at some of the different organizations that are here in New York. Palestine Legal, that's working on the Right to BDS campaign, Adala New York, Jewish Voice for Peace, Code Bing, Students for Justice in Palestine. There's a number of organizations that are active here in New York where you can find some place to start now that you're all inspired to start working on the BDS movement. I want to once again thank Verso Books and Jewish Voice for Peace for organizing this, and thank you all for braving the rain and the wind. Thank you.